So now we're going to move on to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, as you can see in that diagram to the top right corner, is located in the Middle East, modern-day Middle East area, in between Asia Minor or Turkey and the Persian Gulf. You got the Tigris and Euphrates River, which would be around Iran, Iraq area. The Fertile Crescent is what this is called, because it kind of curves around like a crescent moon there. Two distinct river valleys that ran largely parallel to each other. Not much rain in this region. It's a little bit of a deserty type of region. However, once again, flooding of those two rivers was pretty predictable. And so it's not just one river with a delta like the Egyptian area was. There you can see in the bottom left. This area had two rivers, and so that kind of creates a parallel zone of agriculture. You live in the middle of it, you're good to go. You got food on both sides. You live on one side of it only, that's still fine, because you have all this access to food and land. Lots of water is needed to supply the areas in between and outside this area, and so that once again equals irrigation, and irrigation once again equals an organized government system, and that starts to occur right around the time of 3000 BCE. Your first organized civilization here are the Sumerians. Right around 5000 to 2000 BCE is when their kind of heyday is. They developed these things called city-states. It's not one massive collective kingdom. It's a bunch of different little kingdoms that share some trade, they share some laws possibly, but they are still disconnected for some reason. They are usually interdependent, which means they kind of depend on each other for the stuff like resources, but at the same time they kind of are saying, hey, we're on our own as well. Kind of like AP World. There are 4 of us that teach this class. We are interdependent on one another. We work together. However, we are still different. I teach my class differently than Ms. Rodriguez teaches her class, or Mr. Agnew from Mr. Tovey, or vice versa. Agricultural areas plus the city dominate most of these city-states. Right? You have these 2 major rivers, little zones along the river. So what's going to dominate the river? The people that are in this little city-state. Okay? Egyptians have pyramids, basic pyramid structure, right? The Mesopotamian example are called ziggurats. They are more stepped, but they're the same basic structure. Irrigation systems are really important for the Sumerians because that's what they're going to use to irrigate all this land. Political power, how do we do that? That's held in the temples. Landholders having power. That is a really important idea. For the most part, when you start looking at culture and politics and the way societies are run or interacted, you have to control some kind of resource to have power. The easiest resource that is controlled by people that have power throughout this course is land. And so that land oftentimes gives people power, because what's grown on the land, what's taken from the land, stuff like that. In some cases, for the Sumerians, these people that are landholders or work in the temples, they hold power before royalty will hold power. And of course, you do have your lugals in the palaces, your leader. Lugal is the term for leader. So you have that as well. So you kind of have like a double system here in the Sumerian world working. 1.3.2.b looks at growth and competition of states for land and resources. The more favorably situated had greater access to things like resources, and therefore they can produce more food surplus, which means they can grow their populations. So in the course of the Mesopotamian world, you got several basic bodies of people that are going to be occurring over time in this first period. The Kassites, the Assyrians are a good example that we'll look at later. The Hittites are a good example for several reasons. All 3 of these and some other ones are going to spread Mesopotamian culture throughout Western Asia. Okay, Southwestern Asia to be more specific. So when you start looking at these 3, they're going to be important because they are very aggressive when it comes to conquest and trade. And that aggressiveness when it comes to conquest and trade also leads to the spread of stuff like culture. And they are going to able, with that spread, that expansion, that aggressiveness, to not only undertake territorial expansion, but they're going to try to conquer the surrounding states. Sometimes that brings Mesopotamia in direct conflict with places like Egypt, for example. And so that is a relationship that is going to be shared. If you look at the picture from the previous slide later on, you can tell they're not too far away from each other. They don't know each other exist, and there is some overlap in time. Trade, super important. First, widespread networks of trade start small scale, go to medium, then go to long distance. The Syrian-Palestine trade for Mesopotamia, for example, is the most important one. Metals are really, really important. The Hittites, for example, had a large iron industry. That iron is going to be useful for building things like chariots and weaponry. That weaponry is going to be used to obviously wage war and expand territories, especially when you start putting it onto new forms of transportation. Horses, camels, chariots. The quicker you can move people and goods, the longer distances you can travel, the quicker you can travel. That stuff's going to be really important for expansion, like we talked about with this key concept. Here's a basic map for you of the region of the Arabic zone, with Egypt still there. So if you can see it, the little dark zone there that kind of circles the Tigris and Euphrates rivers kind of sweeps around. The Hittites are to the north. There's some of the Egyptian areas there to that map where the delta is. You can see that there along the Fertile Crescent is going to be a lot of connection here with trade that's going to eventually occur. Empires, there are a couple of major ones that'll develop over time. The Akkadians in 2350, led by Sargon I. Sargon I has a couple of different things you want to know about. If you do your reading, you can pretty much summarize those things. And then you have Old Babylonia, led, of course, by Hammurabi. We know Hammurabi because he writes a book of code. That law code, that Hammurabi code, is another one of your examples that this unit will expect you to know about, okay, when it comes to literature. They will make sure that you know what is the difference between the Hammurabi's code book and other law giving manuals. His is very strict, it's very rigid. It solidifies social, political, and customary systems over the people by the king. 1.3 Roman numeral 3.c talks about legal code solidifying those three types of systems where a ruler is over the people. Hammurabi's code is a great example of that, and if you look at examples of Hammurabi's code, you will see what kind of rigidity I'm talking about. One of the classic examples we used to teach was Hammurabi's code is the eye for an eye code. You do something that makes somebody lose an eye, if you're found guilty, that's going to mean that your eye typically is taken from you. There are other ones that are kind of weird but are still very direct, like the one where, if a builder builds a house for a family and that house collapses and kills somebody in the family, the builder's son has to die, which is kind of weird, but the video that John Green goes over talks about some of those examples for you. And then, of course, Hammurabi and the Old Babylonians are called the Babylonians because their main capital is the city of Babylon. And this is an example of monumental architecture. Don't go back to 1.3.3.a, looking at monumental architecture being developed by early civilizations, right? Urban planning, architecture. Look at the ziggurats and the way that palaces are built and all that kind of stuff. Here's a really quick and simple little guide for you that shows you kind of the overlap here of different people. This valley, these two valleys, I should say, over thousands of years, go through several ups and downs when it comes to people that are in control. Sumeria is on here, Babylon in the red, the Assyrians in purple to the north. There's some overlap there with the Persians coming around in 525. We'll get to those here shortly with the empires. But you can look at the overlap. Those time periods where people are in charge in different zones can show you there's a loose collection here of these city-states. Economically speaking, you got to talk about long-distance trade being necessary. Eventually, this is really important for this zone because this is going to be the starting point of the Silk Road, which will eventually connect all the way over to China. So the long-distance trade, we know through records, is going to start coming around through bartering and through the merchant class. The merchant class in Mesopotamia will emerge just like it did in the Egyptian world, and you should always look at their status in a society. Some societies value merchants, some societies devalue merchants, and they have reasons for that, socially and politically. Trade here is through bartering. You take a goat. A goat is worth, several bags of grain, or it's worth, a sword, that kind of deal. You barter. You don't have coins. They have started to find more and more evidence of early coin trade coming from the Indus River Valley outward, but that won't come for some time. Don't forget the roots of the trading process. It's through trade of goods. Society breakdowns here, looking at free land owners. Free land through the royalty and the priests. And then they'll become dependent on farmers and artisans. That's when your middle class will appear, right? When people that are working that land have more power and authority to do stuff, that's when you start seeing growth of a middle class. At the very bottom, once again, you have slaves, prisoners of war, through all that conquering that's taking place. And look at women, declining status. So if you had to look at a comparison between Egypt and Mesopotamia, hopefully you can see Egypt typically more positive towards women, Mesopotamia typically more low towards women, declining status. They can own property, and they can trade, and they can control the dowry, but sometimes those things are different than the Egyptian world, sometimes they're not. So look at that. 1.3.3.E looks at new religious belief systems developing in this period, and they have strong influences in later periods. Religiously speaking, they're polytheistic as well. Over 3,000 accounted gods and goddesses in the Mesopotamian world. Many of them are, associated with priesthoods that are built around that. Hereditary priesthoods through families, right? And most of them represent some form of nature. That nature has to be looked at and observed, just like it was in the Egyptian world, in order to be appeased. If something wasn't going right with a harvest, what's to blame? Well, it's probably because you made the water god angry, and so you're not getting as much water or something. So you have to do something to make that god happy. Okay? Humans are created as servants to the gods is the overall underlying principle of the Mesopotamian world. That means that typically there's a negative outlook between the environment of people and the gods. What did we do wrong type of deal, right? What did I do wrong? That's a very pessimistic view. A lot of those views are contained in another one of the most important works that you'll have to know about in this unit, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Your video for John Green talks a little bit about that. It has a little thing about it and what it's about, but basically we anger the gods. The gods create this giant flood, similar to the flood that Christianity holds true with Noah, and it wipes out a lot of people, and eventually we have to make the gods happy again, and we have to make them feel good. Technology and writing, going back to stuff like literature and all that kind of whatnot. How do we write things down? How do we keep a hold of different records, right? Look at part C, look at record keeping. This is through cuneiform. If you see the term cuneiform, you all know automatically, or should know automatically, that's Mesopotamia. Transportation here, boats, barges, and donkeys. Use of pack animals now needs to be discussed. Kind of like a lasting legacy type of deal. So really quickly, you got the number system based on the term 60. You've got different metalwork. Talked about Hittite iron. Now we're talking about bronze being useful. Artisans are part of the merchant middle class, right? So you have different breakdowns there, like the pottery that is being created on a potter's wheel. Those things are being created here in Mesopotamia. Geometry, very similar to what is being used in Egypt, because different things require math, so you got to learn that. And then you have a lunar calendar, which will later on kind of go with the 365-day calendar and kind of get merged together. And of course, astronomy, multiple gods. Where the gods live? For the most part, they live in the heavens, in the sky, right? So they'll be able to look at and interpret what's going on in the world above our own. That's astronomy, the birth of astronomy. Finally here, not finally, but we're going to get to the Assyrians here. It's kind of like our starting to be done with this. In northern Mesopotamia, these are your heavy hitters, 9th century BCE, further on along in time, right? Look at trade, 1.3.3.f. Trade expansion in this period, starting in regional and trans-regional, with civilizations exchanging goods, cultural ideas, and technology. Trade is super important, starting off with small scale and going to big scale. It's really important you know what the term trans-regional means. We had an essay a couple years back, and kids bombed it because they didn't know what the term trans-regional meant. So make sure you look it up if you don't already know it. Overlapping trade with the Egyptians, for example, is important because it looks at the large-scale systems of trade happening in this region and in this time period. And this is what I'm talking about. If you look at the overlapping time here, this is only about 200 years, give or take, of the Assyrian Empire. But those borders move, and sometimes those borders will clash or overlap with the Egyptian borders. And so once again, trade, expanding, growing, contracting, whatever, really important as it starts to illustrate the growth of money and power through money and selling goods and whatnot. A couple other ones here on politics. The king is chosen by the gods. It's not a dynastic system where the pharaoh is God, a living God. These kings are chosen by gods. That means that they have both religious and secular duties, right? So you're expanding religion and politics, kind of combining them. And they will use propaganda to make sure that they are recognized as the person who is in control of both religion and secular duties. Specialized troops, a lot of iron means you can have a lot of weapons. Those weapons are fashioned into specialized units in the military, and that's what's going to be used by the people like the Hittites and the Assyrians, for example, to create these large armies who use terror tactics and deportation to get their messages across as they start to expand. With most empires, eventually they expand beyond their control, and when they get too big, those areas are hard to keep under control, and therefore they start to collapse and go into chaos. Officials here will try at first to do things like collecting taxes and maintaining order, raising troops through conscription or some kind of draft process, and of course construct and maintain public works. Roads are an important one, no-brainer. Irrigation canals, other buildings, etc. Eventually those things, though, are not good at being controlled, and therefore, once again, chaos. 1.3 Roman numeral 3.g looks at social and gender hierarchies. Once again, look at the pyramid structure of a social class discussion. You can look at social and gender as the really easy ones here. You have free people, you've got landowning citizens here in the Assyrian world, you've got your farmers and your artisans in the middle, and then eventually you've got your slave classes towards the bottom. This is a very architectural economy, but there are also merchants, and those merchants have to flow somewhere in this social pyramid. And then at the end, those pyramid structure hierarchical breakdowns are solidified, we know, through different collections of texts that occurred when the Mesopotamians built libraries. This is really important because 1.3.3.h looks at literature being a reflection of overall cultural attributes. Once again, go back to your other examples. What does the Epic of Gilgamesh teach us? It teaches us that we need to be appeasing to the gods. That means we had multiple gods. What does the Book of the Dead teach us? It teaches us that the body needs to be prepared because it has a very short life expectancy, but in the afterlife it's going to live for much longer. The spirit, right? So we got to make sure we take care of it in order to make that afterlife awesome. Mesopotamian world, we know we have free people and landowning citizens in this breakdown because it's told to us in text. Conquest here, I think this is your last slide. Eventually, the Assyrians, through that map that you just saw a couple of slides back, are going to expand and move outward. They're going to take over and control Israel. It creates the very first diaspora that this course will look at, the Israeli diaspora. The Phoenicians to the northwest will start to maintain and order trade, and they will colonize areas outside of this region. Then, of course, the Assyrians will take control of Egypt over time, at least for a little bit. They'll conquer Babylonia. They can't keep that control forever, however, because the borders are too wide. So eventually you have other groups taking out the Assyrians. Those were the Medes people. And then, of course, Neo-Babylonians will take out the Medes. And basically you have a process where you have constant upheaval and overthrow and chaos that will eventually lead us to time period 2 when we start looking at empires. And the Persians more often are the great example of takeover points there. So that concludes for today your breakdown of 1.3 with urban societies in your early agricultural worlds in the places of Egypt and Mesopotamia.